All right, my name is David Wong. I'm Eatings on Twitter. I'm not Jeff Eaton, though I get accused of being that all the time. People come to me, I love your content articles. It wasn't me, the non-Chinese guy wrote it. And so the thesis of this talk is front-end developers are expected to know a lot, and I don't think anybody here would dispute that. No, really a lot. The title of the talk comes from this Far Side. Those of you who are old enough to remember the Far Side when it was in the newspaper, there's this kid who I guess is microcephalic or something. Mr. Osborne, may I be excused? My brain is full. On a more serious note, this was a blog post by Frank Camaro, actually from this year, just a handful of months ago, or a few months ago, and I'll read the entirety. Quote, "It's time to come clean. GitHub is confusing. Git is confusinger. Pretty much everything in a modern web stack no longer makes sense to me, and nobody explains it well because they assume I know some fundamental piece of information that everyone takes for granted and no one documented, as if it were a secret that spread around to most everyone sometime in 2012, yet I somehow missed because, you know, life was happening to me. So I've given up on trying to understand, even the parts where I try to comprehend what everyone else is working on that warrants that kind of complexity, and now I fear that makes me irrelevant. So I nestle close to my story that my value is in my ideas and capability to make sense of things, even though I can't make sense of any of the above. But really, maybe I'm doing okay. Since it's all too much to know, let the kids have it." Does everybody know who Frank Camaro is? Okay, so Frank Camaro is under the age of 35 and has worked for such places as the New York Times. And so he is not exactly what you would call an old person or an old-timer at this, and these are his feelings. Interestingly enough, I have an addendum to this. I asked him on Designer News, AMA, how he felt about that post 3 or 4 months later, and we'll talk about this at the end. So how did we get here? And here's the history lesson, a relatively short history. So this is the Drupal 7X Alpha. It was released January 15th, 2010, a little over 4.5 years ago. I started working with Drupal 7 as soon as the alpha was cut. You could certainly have worked with it before, but we're generally going to talk about everything that's happened since this 4-year-ago span. So DrupalCon San Francisco, April 2010. What are the things people are talking about here? They're talking about, we have PHP for designers, theme preprocess functions, CSS3, the future is now. These are the things that, elevating 960GS. Who remembers using 960GS? So this is DrupalCon. These are the premier sessions on what is currently called design, theme, and usability in 2010, April 2010. This is DrupalCon Chicago in March of 2011. You notice that there's this section. Oh, you can't see my thing here. There's a section on theming. There's this notion of theming. This is DrupalCon in 2012 in Denver. There's a mobile track now. Theming's gone away, but there's a design track for this. And then DrupalCon Austin, which it's not today anymore, but this was prepared for DrupalCon Austin. There's the idea of a front end. Mobile has gone away. Mobile is no longer a distinct track of development or a distinct practice. So there's front end, but the idea of design has sort of sublimated into the ether or been folded into something else. So we don't really, at least in the Drupal community, even have a strong sense of what front end means, at least over the last handful of years. So the state of the web since Drupal 7 was initially first cut. So when the Alpha 1 for Drupal 7 launched, IE 8.7.6 at 56% market share. Mobile usage was under 2%, starting in 2010. Everybody was in love with static CSS script frameworks. This, again, presentation was originally prepared for Austin, and Massimo Vignelli had just passed away a couple days before, so there's a shout out for static CSS. But who here has worked with a static CSS framework here? 960, Blueprint, et cetera. Okay, good. So when I hate on them, you guys will know what they're all about. So Blueprint CSS, this Drupal.org was originally prototyped on this by Mark Bolton, and there was actually a huge hubbub like, why can't we make everything in Drupal with Blueprint CSS? This is awesome. And then 960GS, Todd Nienkerk at Four Kitchens, he made 2-3 years worth of presentations worth just presenting on this alone. And this was, we got a lot of mileage in Drupal out of using these static CSS frameworks. Web typography circa 2010 was these are your fonts. This is all you get. Have fun with these, all 7 of these fonts. And if if they weren't good enough for you, then, maybe you did something crazy with Cipher or Kufone and you're injecting, Flash replacements so you can finally get, a cool font in there. But you had to download a custom module, a contributed module, and then, incorporate a library and then, flashify your fonts as well. We had competing JavaScript libraries in around 2010. Like this was actually a debate. We're like, well, maybe this jQuery thing's not going to really take off. Maybe we should use prototype instead. Oh no, I really like MooTools. I just override jQuery. This was something that people still talked about as a thing. People still debated in 2010 if version control was something that front-enders needed to know. I remember Morton, who's not here for me to actually call out on this, but Morton DK, during one of his sessions, after one of his really, really long rants, said, okay, maybe I finally need to learn Bazaar. And, this was kind of a thing. We just went ahead and committed directly to the production server. That was just normal for front end. Like, maybe the back-end developers would have to do something with this Bazaar or, CVS or SVN thing. But, the front enders don't have to worry about that. The idea that you might possibly use CSS3 in 2010 was still something that people were arguing for or against, as if it was a waste of time, or browsers don't support it, don't bother learning it, we have to ship sites a day, who knows when we're actually going to get support for that. And that's just general front end. So talking about Drupal front end in particular, in 2010, and I think for a large portion of the front end community now, you are a themer. And I put themer in quotes because there's a set of expectations and a set of it's a label. Themer is a label. The themer isn't a job. Nobody actually proudly goes out to the world and says, oh yeah, I'm a themer, right? Themer is your label within the Drupal community. And your title may be something fancy, but this is how people described you within the community. And maybe this is also how you describe yourself. This is the label. When Drupal 7 first came out, this is your media query. You added another line in your info file, and you threw some parameters at it, and this is your media query at the time. These were your style sheets. These long-ass, crazy, freight trains of selectors to get that one thing that you need at the very end. And ultimately, this is your job. You take a PSD, you make it show up on the web to make sites that look like this. Or this, or this. So, 2010, good times. So what's happened since then? And this is going to be all kind of obvious to you guys, and everybody sort of lived this in this room, so I won't spend too much time on this, but this happened. HTML5, CSS3 happened, And this is actually largely because this happened, Chrome, mobile browsers, etc. Greatly accelerated the uptake of HTML5 and CSS3 technology. This happened. And not just this particular model of device, obviously, but this whole class of devices changed the game entirely, which led to M sites. Who here has built an M site? All right. Mobile web apps. Who here has built something with jQuery Mobile or jQuery Touch? All right. Adaptive websites. Who's built a fixed width, device-sensitive layout for a page that wasn't fluid? Okay. And just a little exactly over 4 years ago, this happened, this article. Who here's read this article? Who knows this article I'm talking about here? So this is the original responsive web pages or responsive websites article by Ethan Marcotte that came out in a list apart just a little over 4 years ago. This was like May 2010. So it wasn't that long ago, but it kind of feels a long, so much has happened since then. Ethan Marcotte's article on responsive web design and the rebirth of progressive enhancement, which was sort of a buzzword, and now it's actually a thing. It's legitimate now, as opposed to, oh, maybe we'll do this and that. Progressive enhancement is completely a thing now. And so we'll stop here for a second to pause to consider. All this time, Drupal 7 has not changed. And so the Drupal 7 that launched in the alpha in January has not changed. It is not responsive. It has no considerations for responsive. It has no considerations for mobile. And anything that's happened in the front end has basically happened to the ignorance of Drupal core. And I have to add that Drupal 7 core is essentially the Drupal 7 core we have now. And so, all the stuff that's happened in the last 4 years has happened in the despite of Drupal core. As it is irrelevant, or not irrelevant, but it's ignorant of all these changes. It's just kind of been the same Drupal core that we've always known. So meanwhile, in the rest of the web world, there's things like Ruby, there's things like Node, opinionated web frameworks in different languages that have ideas of their own, and they're moving quickly on them. Drupal 7 has not changed. JavaScript has become cool again. Who here has written JavaScript for something other than jQuery in the last year? Dude, you can't be the only one. Oh, okay, but there's two. Okay. All right, well, we're going to talk about JavaScript anyway, so too bad. Haha. So everybody knows it already. So let's just use it everywhere, right? So there's JavaScript on the back end. Node is a legitimate scripting language for your server in V8. JavaScript on the front end, JavaScript templating, handlebars. JavaScript for automation, for Grunt, if you need to automate your builds for, your SAS compilation and whatnot. A competing standard for JavaScript automation that just came out recently that's displacing a previously held standard. JavaScript for package management. You can use things like Bower to package up front-end components for reuse. And then JavaScript for everything, Angular, Ember, and all these other products that basically, completely replace Drupal if you want. Which, well, maybe JavaScript isn't so awesome after all. So let's write a different language that compiles down to JavaScript so that we don't have to deal with JavaScript's quirks anyway. And so there's things like CoffeeScript. I've actually interviewed candidates that actually don't know JavaScript at all. They've only ever used CoffeeScript. So if you, wanted to feel really, really old, there are kids graduating from school now that only know CoffeeScript, which is craziness, because CoffeeScript is... So CoffeeScript is like...
It's like more elegant.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like
derived from JavaScript?
Yeah, it's like what SAS is for CSS, but for JavaScript. So you get like cool syntax goodies. And there's the same idea for HTML. There's HAML, right? There's, if you're writing projects in Ruby, you get HAML, which is, HTML without the insanity, and then of course SAS and CSS, SAS and Compass and Less and Stylus and all these other things. Meta languages for CSS, so we have SAS CSS framework, we have more CSS frameworks with Less, we have even more CSS frameworks with Stylus, we have libraries on top of frameworks, we have libraries on top of libraries on top of frameworks, we have frameworks for layouts, we have frameworks for buttons. You get the idea. So, but still. Has anybody ever heard somebody say, that looks a lot like Drupal, right? All the stuff is changing on the front end. Drupal still dictates the way that your markup comes out. The output styling is still the starting point of all Drupal sites. Drupal is opinionated in its own way about what kind of markup comes out, and that in turn dictates the way that you have to theme it. And you have stuff like this, there's Drupal sites that are beautiful that still have alerts that look like this. Or, they have bulleted lists down the side that look like this you have to unset. The one thing I didn't put down here that is the bane of every front-ender's existence is vertical tabs. And I should have put a picture of vertical tabs. Unsetting and mobilizing vertical tabs is the worst thing in the universe. You have forms that are, you have to dig into PHP to style these forms. Where's the point being, we're solving for an entirely new universe of front-end problems and use cases, but the same old Drupal bullshit is there. It hasn't changed since 2010. So this is the 73rd slide. I've gone through 73 slides worth of talk, and we still haven't covered performance, touch, contextual awareness, testing, asset management, critical path, personalization, web component, shadow DOM, backbone underscore, designing in the browser, live prototyping, A/B testing. The list goes on and on. So, 73 slides, and I haven't even touched this stuff. My brain is full. There's no more room. So this is where we segue into, the rant is over, and now we talk about more positive things. There's this idea, and I don't think I'm unique in feeling this. When I first presented this at DrupalCon Austin, there was a really strong response to this particular idea, and that front end is its own thing. I think too often we don't think of front end as a thing. Front end is somewhere we put junior developers, or front end is something you learn, say, at your crash course at Dev Bootcamp or whatnot, but it's something that you learn and you get out of the way, like your times tables or arithmetic or basic grammar. But front end is its own thing, and it's complete with its own software stack, tooling, best practices, testing frameworks skill set. And it's as complex and as diverse as the backend itself. And so what we have here is the old rules don't apply. It's not about styling the output after the backend developers do the heavy lifting. And it's not a place where you put your junior developers until they become application developers and level up, and then you shove the next set of college grads into their place. So I should give a shout out too that I was not, when we originally wrote this for DrupalCon, my collaborator Brian, who couldn't be here today, he's very big on this particular point. Shout out to Brian Wald, PC Wald, by the way, or Brian Wald at twitter.com. So if you should follow him too. Building a modern, responsive, high-performance, front-end heavy site requires changing the process, and it requires equal footing between front-end and back-end developers in determining application architecture, and respect that both sides have equal rigor and maturity in each other's practices. It's not like the sloppy front-end and the hardcore back-end anymore. Both sides are equally just as hardcore and rigorous and have their own demands that need to be met. And unfortunate reality is that a Drupal core release spans multiple front-end production life cycles. Like that's just something that's going to happen. It took 4 years for 4 years and counting for Drupal 8 to come out. And look how much has happened then. How long are we going to need Drupal 8 to withstand, sea changes in practice, when it comes out? All the stuff that I just talked about, that, all 73 slides worth of stuff happened within the 4 years since Drupal 7 came out. Who foresaw all of these? I can guarantee you nobody in this room, me included, saw all that stuff coming up. And Drupal needs to be more malleable and ready to adapt as new things change, because things are going to change whether Drupal likes it or not, whether we in this room like it or not. And just as a graph to show you about, so this is the lifespan of Drupal 7. That's the top bar. And just a handful of things that we found and slapped on here. So you'll see that this line, like Bootstrap 1.0, which is terrible, by the way, was around at this time, and it's lasted the entire duration of the Drupal project. And, things like Blueprint and Angular. So you'll notice that in the last 2 years, things like Angular and Foundation and Grunt have really taken off, right? These are just a handful of things I just pulled out of the front-end goodie bag. If you notice, if we came up, when we were here at the very, very, start of this, things like Blueprint were popular, 960 were popular, jQuery mobile was definitely a thing. People were still using Kufone to inject fonts. At the time, these all seemed like really great best practices and we'll be using them forever. How did we know? How could we have known that this is how we would be doing things afterwards? And that these other things that we were so in love with then would just fall off and become irrelevant. And so the greater point being, we need to seriously make Drupal more take-apartable if we want to build things that last. We can't be fully in love with things that are the new hipness now and then assume that they're going to be around forever, because they won't. And today's great idea is going to look like idiocy in the next year. And then who knows what the next thing is going to be. So that we need to make Drupal more take-apartable so we can build the things we want versus just shaping Drupal into approximation of our platonic ideas. And so that our front end is resilient to the next big change, because we don't know where that's going to come from, and it's generally going to take us all by surprise. And whether we like it or not, it's going to happen. And so I want to preface something then that I don't have easy answers. And there are no easy answers in this. And I think there's a particular growing pain that we're undergoing in front-end practice, in Drupal especially, about what our roles and what the expectations of the front end are. And there's this idea of a decoupled Drupal, right? We've gotten a lot of mileage about talking about this in the last 3 or 4 months. Who here's heard the word Headless Drupal before? These guys don't count. These Pantheon guys, whatever. So non-Pantheon guys, who else has heard of Headless Drupal? Okay, good. Who here's heard about the new Twig system? Who here's looked at the new Twig system? Okay. Okay. Okay, this talk's going to get a little longer. So I've blown through these slides in literally 20 minutes, which is probably 10 minutes faster than I thought I would. And so we will do, this is story time now. So there's this idea that Drupal can exist as a backend, right? So there's things that Drupal do really well, include things like content management, content editing, roles and permissions, the structure behind the content. And there's this idea that there's always going to be this Drupal theme layer, right? But what if we didn't have to deal with the Drupal theme layer? What if Drupal had more bits and pieces that we could tease apart at the front end? Because, I'll be honest, a lot of Drupal sites right now are still, install Zen, install Omega, style the output that you get, and maybe install a couple custom modules, and then you get a little cleaner markup, a little better markup, or if you want to reach in deeply into Drupal, you get like no classes or whatever. But it's still just let's slap some CSS, slap some JavaScript on top of it, and we get sort of something that looks like the comp. What if you didn't have to do that? What if you could keep the Drupal layer there and persistent and have that last years and years, and if you needed to swap out the front end and not just like switching base themes, but like, we want to rip out an entire portion of the front end or make the front end a completely separate app that you can maintain or otherwise treat as a separate app talking that you can, okay, let me start this over again. Drupal has its own release schedule. Drupal has its own life cycle. What we've shown here previously is that the front end has its own life cycle, and it's much shorter than that of Drupal. And tying your front end to Drupal's lifecycle means that you're going to have a quickly out-of-date site, or you're going to have to abandon technologies at a much faster rate than you would like. If you could move the display layer, the front end of Drupal, away into something that has its own release cycle that isn't tied to Drupal's capabilities, you get the best of both worlds. Drupal gets to be Drupal, and your front end gets to be front end. And there's multiple ways to attack this. There's Headless Drupal is the idea that you can break off all of Drupal's display layer to its own separate application, whether it's running on Angular, if it's running on Ember, or if you're running, you could do this in totally different ways, and not necessarily with JavaScript frameworks either. Or if Drupal had a front-end pipeline that didn't necessarily tie so deeply into themes. What if Drupal could output other things that weren't necessarily themes, or tie you down strictly to Twig? Breaking apart this idea that Drupal has default output, and it's always going to be this default output, there are a number of people pushing for this in Drupal core in various ways, whether it be headless or otherwise. And it's the direction that we really need to go in, because ultimately, front end is going to move and change, whether Drupal is there or not. And the wonderful thing about you people here being front enders is that whether Drupal lives or dies, your skills persist with you. And so this is where the presentation ended last time. We ran out of slides, and then it just went into discussion of people going up to the mic and either ranting or cheering and or asking really hard questions. But there is one thing that I do want to add here, and I think this is completely undersold in the front-end community, at least in Drupal. Career development. Don't leave home without it. Just because you're a front-ender doesn't mean that your career development needs to follow a path of application development. And it also doesn't mean that you getting better at that particular front-end set of skills is illegitimate or something that is better spent learning, say, back-end coding, PHP coding, writing core modules for Drupal. Like, there's career development paths for front-end that should be followed and should be pursued. And in many cases, especially if you're working in Drupal, in the Drupal universe, it's going to be up to you to push for it because your bosses aren't going to see this need, or it's not going to be apparent to them. And you should insist upon it. Don't leave home without it. And so that's sort of my, I don't have all the answers answer, but I'm certainly up for discussing this topic. When we originally wrote this, Brian and I, that we wanted to spur a conversation more than anything else because it was kind of a problem that we had seen throughout the Drupal space, from the smallest nonprofit, half-time worker to, people at large corporations, much larger than the one even I work for. There is this notion that front end is just this thing, and you put people there and they do this thing, and the real work is being done somewhere else. And that's patently false. Real work is being done at front end just as difficult and rigorous as any other department in your engineering cycle. And it should be respected and treated that way. And the kind of affordances, career path-wise, skills-wide, training-wide, they should be treated as no less than the equal of the back end. Thanks, guys. So mostly this talk is meant for provoking discussion. I guess it's one way of saying trolling people, but that's not my intent. But go ahead.
So I get what you're saying about, what we need to know is a lot harder, but at the same time, like, a lot of these tools make my job a lot easier.
Oh, no. Oh, yeah. So, right.
It's
Yes.
easier to do the right thing.
Yes. I guess the one point that I had not brought up is that what we're expected to know is a lot more complex. And these tools are there to make your life easier, to achieve these complex considerations that weren't necessarily present around in 2010 or when Drupal 7 first came out. And so these tools are meant to make your life easier. It's just that for a large portion of the population, I would say, that the usage of these tools and the full implication of the necessity of these tools is lost upon them. They're like, oh yeah, just go make your CSS work better, whatever, we don't care.
And then another question is, like, why do we have to silo the development? There's the whole concept of the full stack developer, especially in the Node.js community, where you can have, there's the whole idea of the mean stack, where you can have, what was it, MongoDB. Anyways, it's using JavaScript all the way through to power your Angular app,
right.
the highly performant app, and no longer do you just have, one person working on that just writes CSS and that's it,
right?
Or chain around and markup a little bit.
I think that works in the Node community because it's JavaScript all the way through. There's this weird divide here where there's this PHP layer in Drupal, right? Which, if you want to be a full stack developer in Drupal, you have to know both PHP and JavaScript and know it at a fairly high level of proficiency to achieve the same thing. I think there's an efficiency when you're just writing JavaScript all the way from end to end that you can more readily say, oh yeah, I'm a full stack developer. Who here writes both front end and back end code fully for their projects? Who here has written back end code to their, let's say, at the insistence of others, but not by choice? Okay. I think until until the entire stack is on a single language, you're probably not going to see in the Drupal space this idea of this full stack developer. It's at least not at the level of complexity that I'm imagining it. Like I think for a smaller, simpler site, yeah. Sure.
I'm a freelancer for nonprofits that are on pretty constrained budgets. So my clients don't generally need custom modules because it's not sustainable for if you're like a little nonprofit on a budget.
Sure.
You want to stick to contrib and kind of the superhighway. But when I made the transition out of being a nonprofit techie, like in a nonprofit, to being an independent consultant, I felt so overwhelmed trying to figure out like what I wanted to do.
Sure. And
just the things that you covered, like that's just front end. And I've found that I'm more effective when I can't even do the whole universe. Like I don't work with Angular.
Sure.
Right? And I started figuring out that there were certain things in that front end world that I just have a passion for. Like CSS. I love CSS. I enjoy jQuery, and I'm really interested in accessibility. And like just keeping up with those things I can't imagine like adding back-end development. I can't imagine adding more giant chunks of things that have their own like ecosystem of things to track. Just tracking like responsive design patterns and CSS, new innovations in CSS and HTML5, and like that is all so much to take in. Because like I have a family and like I have like pets, and this is one of the only Drupal camps that I will attend like on a weekend because I like it so much. But because and that's a whole separate topic about sometimes open source development not being family friendly or parent. I'm not even gonna say like moms because that's a separate topic too. But like there's dads too who want to like be home.
Right.
So I can't go to all of the things. And so I found that just like focusing has really helped me in my career a tremendous amount.
No, absolutely. And opposite of the idea of the full stack developer, I think specialization and focusing are very, very good things to do, especially since it's so broad now that there's tremendous value to be had in focus if there's something that you want to specialize in. I think the ecosystem is big enough such that specialization is good. We don't all have to be apex predators. You know, some of us can be, you know, so there's this fish that lives by sharks, and all they do is, the little wrasse fish, W-R-A-S-S-E, and all they do is they swim under other fish, and they basically eat the parasites off the bigger fish. And because they're so helpful, the bigger fish never consume them, because they'll swim through the gills of larger predatory fish, eat the parasites off their gills and their scales, and it's part of this greater, you know, coral reef ecosystem, right? But they're super specialized. They do this one thing. They swim around bigger fish that would otherwise prey on them and eat the you know, the parasites off of them. And it's their free dinner, and the big fish protect them because it's useful.
I was just kind of wondering, is there anywhere that you see the narratives of these developing technologies being discussed? Like, could something like the crowdfunding for writers and people who make quick intro videos help link these things together? Like, you know, where do people first hear about things like Compass and SAS? And how can we encourage more people to kind of introduce these things?
Go ahead.
I mean, there are a plethora of sources.
But that's the problem, is the plethora.
Yeah.
It's just drinking from a fire hose.
It
And
goes back to
there aren't
privacy.
enough hours in the day to read everything, much less
But
actually
you
use some
can
work and
start
have
with
bandwidth.
just one. I mean,
Or like a
I think
list- like a
CSS
list of
tricks
part.
would be
But
great,
my
or a
question
list
would
of
be,
part.
yeah, I mean, you've got a list of art, but there's a million other places, and
Yeah.
the next cool thing isn't going to come up on list of art, it's going to come up somewhere else. And you know, there's Drupal Planet, and that's great. It's just, there is
So
too
there-
much. I want an answer.
So, well, so there is one thing to be said. I had dinner with a friend who has strong opinions about this last night, and she said that there's also this contrary notion where, you know, I listed all these things that are up there. There's this other desire, too, where people want to play with the newest toys, right? And it's like, oh, 0.1x dev? Sure, what the hell? I'll install it on my site, right? Or, you know, this is a 0.08 alpha release of a JavaScript library. You know, what the heck? Let's plug it in. It does this really cool effect, right? And that itself is not sustainable either, and I'm not advocating for that. But certainly, this might go back to the career development part. Some of it is also on us individually to keep up with this. You know, like nobody's going to hold our hand to move this forward. And it's kind of table stakes to the game now. You know, the table stakes have risen if you want to play this particular game. Go ahead.
I think there's a lot of online, like what you were asking about, there's a lot of online courses like Learnable and things like that that discuss SAS and Foundation and all those things. So if you're interested, you know.
It's not that there aren't tools to learn it. It's that while you're doing your everyday work, which is a 12-hour day to start with,
Sure.
and then you're still maintaining your skills in what you already know, and you're learning this whole new layer of skills practically every week. It's just that there's this brain full syndrome.
Darius.
I mean, to me, necessity is the mother, right? So if your workflow or your aspirations don't need to pull shit from the back end and your front end, and that's taken care of, and that's not really something you want to do, then don't go fishing around for frameworks to do that, right? But if you're like, oh, I really wish this functionality was here, I want to be able to do it myself, now you know there's an entire ecosystem where you can just start Googling, like, you know, so it comes to you when you need it, I'd say.
In the back.
My thought is really, it's good to know a little bit about a lot of things, but then you have to specialize. If you just think back over the last 10 years, the number of different specialization options that have emerged, you know, there's so many different areas that you can actually specialize and make a living completely doing one thing, which you really couldn't have done 10 years ago. I mean, you were either a designer or a developer, and there wasn't even that much distinction between the type. So I think going forward, there's going to be more technology. There's going to be more frameworks. There's going to be so much more of everything. There's a whole country of continents that haven't gotten involved in this yet. There's tons more people who are going to be making more things. So absolutely specialize. Be aware of what's going on around, you know, and know that there are things you can probably use with limited knowledge, but definitely find where you're happy, and then just keep your eye on the larger ecosystem.
With keeping up with things, one of the ways that I'm able to keep up with things is that I work with another group of people at my office, and we have our own like we use HipChat to talk to each other, we used to use Skype. But we'll share resources with each other on there, and we'll all find them from different places, and we're not all reading the same things all the time, but having a group of people that you know who do the same type of work, who share things with each other, is really useful to have. And I'll go and check out all the links that people send, and I won't use everything, but
We've shared Friday at work, where we come together at lunch, pick a topic, you get like 5 minutes, you know. We have a lot of talks like that.
yeah, one of our coworkers just did a presentation on Frontend the other day.
Cool,
So
yeah.
get everybody else up to speed with it. You know, it's nice, like, you know, one person really digs in deep to one thing and then shares it with the rest, and that seems like a good system.
So why do you think the front end has been so lacking in Drupal for a long time? Like, we still in Drupal 8 we won't have like JavaScript unit tests.
Sure,
Or,
right.
You know.
Well, I'll blame Teo on that one. I'll just personally blame a person. No, but go ahead, yeah.
I mean, partially it is open source, so
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
my
yeah.
fault, you know,
Yeah.
they're not contributing enough.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to be such an issue, like the Rails has the asset pipeline, and
Yeah.
they've been supporting CoffeeScript
Yep.
and SAS for a long time.
Mhm.
They've been taking, you know, the Rails community has been a major contributor to these front-end frameworks
Mhm.
and providing a reliable,
Absolutely.
like REST API. Do you think that Drupal 8 really wouldn't be able to provide that, you know, what a front-ender would really want for REST API and provide it performantly? Or, because I know that
Maybe. Maybe. The best question is maybe. And the answer to why it hasn't happened, as far as I can come up with, is that I don't want to be impolitic here. I feel like, you know, I have my, you know, after 2 whiskeys answer, and then my, you know, in front of, you know, my being recorded by a guy with, you know, headphones on for posterity answer. And so the posterity answer would be, I think just Drupal does a okay, fine. Okay, this is my halfway whiskey answer. Drupal does a really shitty job of holding on to front-enders throughout their careers, and they level up and do something else instead that meets their needs better. And I think that's a problem. And I know that's a problem. And this talk was sort of born out of initially, this was a much rantier talk when I first wrote this, and I toned it down a lot, but it had a lot to do with the fact that, you know, for a lot of the Drupal space, in front end at least, it's up and out meaning some other technology stack, you know? And it shouldn't have to be that way, because in other technology stacks, you know, it's up and contribute and make it better, not up and out. And I don't know what the answer to that particular problem is. You know, that's an Angie Byron question, honestly. Hopefully she has something to say about that. But that's what I think historically has been the problem, and I don't know necessarily how to fix it. Yeah.
Throw in another thing. I think that, like, if you want people to make these topics legible, then people have to get paid to write about them. And I think that's really important. And you know, I just think that that's something as a whole ecosystem has to be treated appropriately, along with other, you know, forms of documentation, and it tends to get lost.
Well, it's not just pay, I think it's motivation, right? So motivation can come through payment, but motivation can also come through passion. And you know, you have to find people that are passionate about something and want to actually express it and figure out how to make those pieces happen, because it's a hard problem to solve.
Yeah.
And the problem is passion only gets you so far when you can do with a really, really complex issue. You know, the really complex issue, it's just passion that's driving you. You get hit down enough, then your passion is going to start to wane, and then you're not going to be motivated anymore, and then you go up and out. And that's, you know.
Go ahead, Janet.
Me?
Yeah, Janet.
Oh.
Yeah.
So I don't mean this to be a plug, but but there's a new nonprofit that started in Western Mass. The acronym was coined by Forrest Mars, NERD, New England Regional Developers. And we're having,
Forrest came up with that.
Of course he did, right? Like, and like Kelly Albrecht of Last Call Media, he decided that he wanted to make it into a giant conference, which is going to be at UMass Amherst, September 12th, 13th, and 14th. And the concept behind the Nerd Summit is kind of twofold. It's the whole, like, Larry Garfield, like, let's get off the island. And so it was a Drupal camp, and it's been kicked out to include, like, WordPress and Ruby and Python and just, like, general stuff. So we're talking, like, bringing more tech diversity. And the other thing is to bring more human diversity. So we've got, like, lots of women, for starters, because we're in New England, so people of color is especially in Western Mass, is a tougher nut to crack. But that's our long-term goal, is diversity and more diversity. And what's kind of the main aim of Nerds is to increase the number of people who are in these collaborative kind of peer learning communities that really the Drupal community is so good at, like Drupal meetups, these camps, like we're all coming together. Nerds is a free conference. This was like $30, right? We're all here, we are talking about these things. And so what Nerds is trying to do is just like pull in more people who maybe don't usually come to these things and try and experiment with like just increasing the diversity of people and the diversity of kinds of technologies that cross-pollinate in New England. I have postcards if you want to grab one and know more about the conference, but I do think that these kinds of events and local meetups that go on throughout the year are another place where we can come together. If you don't have like I'm a freelancer, so like I don't have a workplace lunch where I can do that, but I do that through these kinds of things. So that's my plug, sorry, but it does speak to the issue, I think.
I think that directly goes to what I was going to say, is, dare I say, Drupal just doesn't seem cool to the kids anymore. Like, it's just not sexy. It's an identity issue. And things like that, associating a larger ecosystem with Drupal will help bring it out of these trenches of uber dorkiness, I really think that the supportive ecosystem around, you want the company to keep, Drupal has been this obscure, complex, scary, not so cool thing. So events like that will definitely be important for Drupal's future.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I have a more practical question.
We don't deal with practicalities here. It's all high-level ranting here.
Yeah. Well, speaking of career development, if one would want to, one being me, do some headless Drupal stuff, what JavaScript framework or other framework would be in the near future?
Pick one that makes sense to you. I'm not going to go ahead and prognosticate and estimate the half-life of Ember versus Angular or whatever. Pick one that has tutorials that make sense to you, that you can actually build something with, and try that. Because whatever you learn there will carry over to whatever framework actually does survive in 5 years' time. Should I drop the mic now? Was that the mic drop answer? Boom, done, I'm done. Anything else? We believe me, we got plenty of time. I blew through the slides.
Question, is there
Go ahead.
any discussion or thought about having this, you brought up that they're trying to separate the front end from the back end.
Yeah.
Well, break that. One of the things with responsive design, a lot of, and maybe I'm doing this wrong, is basically on mobile devices you're hiding things.
Sure.
And making the back end smart in terms of not sending content out.
Yes.
Is there any kind of conversations going on in Drupal core to say, somehow we have to communicate to the back end that says, oh, these people are on a low bandwidth connection. Don't send this content out, because that's something I don't know about, or is that going on?
Yes, it's not going to be in core. I can tell you who to blame that it's not going to be in core. But if we were to build something that wasn't just strictly Drupal core, that was context aware and could say lazy load content based on your context, yeah, you can absolutely do this. It's one of many use cases for doing headless Drupal, for building a completely custom front end. So you wouldn't have the assumptions of a full page load, on a particular request. You could do things like be aware of, maybe not bandwidth per se, though you could do that still, device constraints, and then only send, don't render a full page and then hide it with, display none, but rather send something.
People who are driving headless are thinking about that in terms of that.
So when you say people are driving headless, that means like, there isn't like this headless committee that's being driven by, like a cabal of people wearing dark robes, and we meet and with red candles. It's really people that are interested in this in a very loosely aligned fashion that are talking about this, because you can kind of do it now already in Drupal 7. And sort of the goals that we have going forward are to make it more standardized and easy for Drupal 8 development to work this way. There are other talks from Austin that I would highly recommend you watching. Like there's one on the Weather Channel. The Weather Channel's an upcoming headless app. I mean, granted, they have like 24 engineers working on this. This is like a hardcore web app, but it's a thing that's happening even now. Has anybody worked on a site that ended up feeding data to, say, an iOS app or anything like that? Okay. Okay, how about, has anybody worked with a site that had feeds on it, that either consumed feeds or pushed feeds to another site? It's kind of the same idea, except that the recipient of the feed wouldn't be another Drupal site, but rather an app that would consume it and display it. So it's not like this crazy radical thing where, you know, we're going to go ahead and do something that's unheard of. It's being done. It's done in different ways. What you just said is just one use case for doing it more. Anything else? I really am going to drop the mic this time, then. I don't think the cameraman would like it, though. He might have to take his headphones off. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I noticed that in this conference, there's a few things on Twig.
Yeah.
Can you talk to speak about that?
Twig is the default templating language for upcoming Drupal 8. And what it's doing is it's replacing things like your tpl.php files will be replaced with Twig files instead. Have you worked with something like Smarty before or Handlebars? Like templating languages with curly braces, right? That's basically what Twig is. So instead of having to do things like, you know, PHP, you know, PHP $ variable, right? Or worse, you know, like print _ render variable name. You can just have curly brace, variable name, close curly brace, done inside your template. And so it's a simpler way of doing templates in Drupal 8. But
That's one more thing you have to.
well, you can unlearn, but you can unlearn tipl.phps. You won't have to deal with those anymore because they're gone.
Yes.
Yeah. Darius.
I feel like design tools are starting to enter their renaissance.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh my god. And I think that Fire is just now starting.
Sure.
Have you experimented with any of the new tools like Macaw or Webflow or like these design in the browser hybrid things?
So I've tried Macaw before because I wanted to try some cool animations, right? It's like, ooh, nice, like this thing moves, right? I haven't done that much with it. But I think, though, for designing the browser, I think that we're only beginning to scratch the surface for designing in the browser. Like this is, in the evolution of the tools for designing in the browser, like we're at the sticks and stones we picked off the ground phase, you know? Like we're nowhere near like wheels and levers or anything like that. So that's definitely a space where a lot of innovation is going to happen and very quickly.
I feel it.
Yeah.
I mean, we still, as front-end designers, are still adding all this crap in the front end.
It's not crap. It's not crap.
All this stuff because we still have IE8 and it's still,
Sure.
you know, in there in the enterprise zone, we are in a big company, so that we're still, you know, hacking.
Okay. Yeah.
Till we get to a point where HTML5 is real and it's everywhere. I don't know.
Yes.
Well, and back to what you just said about like shipping, like Modernizer now as default, like what if I want to roll my own custom, like include my own tests for device
In DA Core?
Instead of, yeah.
Oh, so you just uncheck the library. It's loaded as a library.
Right.
Just pound it out and put your one you want in. Yeah. Anybody else? All right, thank you, everybody.